Welcome to New York Bio's Virtual Breakfast Series, a digital program started in 2020, bringing you fireside chats with leaders across the healthcare spectrum. This week's episode features Dr. James Madara, CEO and Executive Vice President of the American Medical Association.
So good morning. I am Jennifer Hawks Bland, the CEO at NewYorkBIO, and Derek Brand and I are joined by Dr. James Madara, who is the CEO of the American Medical Association. We are super excited about our conversation today, and it will be wide-ranging. I know that you all will have lots of questions, so make sure you put those in the chat for the Q&A. And a special thank you to our New York Bio member Vertex for sponsoring this month's series of breakfast. And we're back after a couple of weeks vacation from our virtual breakfast for real vacations and otherwise over the end of August and Labor Day week. And as a housekeeping note, please join us. If you have not already registered, please do so. The New York Bio annual meeting is coming up on September 27th. So we hope you'll join us that day. With that, we have a lot to talk with Jim about today, so I'm going to kick it over to Derek to do the introduction.
All right, thanks so much, Jennifer. It is great to be back. We've brought back the virtual breakfast series, but haven't yet got rid of the humidity, so we will work on that. Jim, it is wonderful to have you. I can't think of more. I can't think of really a better topic than to think about the AMA and doctors, and over the last really 3 years, the kind of amount of the spotlight and the forefront they've taken in terms of medical care, rightfully so. So it's wonderful to have you here and looking forward to talking with you. We tend to kick things off with a bit of an origin story. And so why don't you tell us a little bit about your journey to the AMA?
Well, when I was small, I had a serious illness and spent some time in a Philadelphia hospital, and that got me interested in medicine. Ended up going to Drexel Medical School, and then spent about 23 years at Harvard for my clinical and research training, then was on the faculty and ran a center there, NIH center. Emory for 5 years as a department chair, and then University of Chicago as dean, and then also CEO of the health system. Before coming to the AMA, which is now almost 13 years ago.
That is so, but let's slow down a little bit, because you just ran through about 35 years of background in like 30 seconds. I am actually impressed, Jim, at the brevity of which you covered the amount of work. But roll back a little bit, right? Because our audience is obviously in part made up of entrepreneurs that are coming out of academia, whether they're spinning out companies or working in the industry. Talk to us about, let's go to your time at Harvard and talk to us about how you were interested in research and development, and then how you decided sort of what was next in your career path, how academia shaped that path.
Yeah, I'll preface this by saying that it's the normal human emotion and strategy to try to make a connected story out of disconnected things. So everyone will take their own personal story and give a logical 1, 2, 3. But I think mine was more of a random walk. So I was interested in cancer in my training, and thought I would do pathology, being the language of cancer. Then learned pathology there was studying molecular basis of disease, and that got me interested in research. So I opened a research lab after doing a research postdoc at Harvard. And then that grew, to 10 postdocs or so, and so a couple of students and technicians and whatnot. And as the lab grew and you had multiple grants, there was an administrative component to it that just organically grew. I was then asked to direct the Harvard Digestive Disease Center. And my suspicion is it was a group of people on the executive committee far senior to me. And I think they wanted to appoint someone they could better control. So they took
Young, impressionable physician scientist.
So they took this young guy, and then actually the funny story about me thinking about leaving Harvard was I got a professorship, a tenured professorship, and they had a party for me in Building A at the top of the quadrangle. And there was a person, Jerry Trier, who was 20 years older than me, now passed away, 25 years older, who had been a tremendous mentor and really kind to me. And so I was hoping Jerry would come. And people were almost starting to leave, and Jerry showed up. I said, Jerry, thanks for coming. And he said, well, congratulations, Jim. This means you'll never leave Harvard. I said, what? And I looked around, and I remember driving home feeling like instead of celebratory, I felt like I'd just gotten a life sentence. And that's the first time it occurred to me, that maybe we should be open to other things.
Yes, the golden handcuffs can be made of different things in different industries, right?
Yeah.
So you did move. You went to did you go straight to Emory from Harvard?
Yeah, so I went to Emory. I had looked at a chair at Hopkins, and when I was doing that, we decided it was the wrong time for us to move. But the dean the dean at Hopkins had moved to Emory as vice chancellor, and I really I thought he was terrific. And so he called me there, and I liked my theory is that universities also reflect sometimes the city that they're in.
Mm-hmm.
So Harvard is very tribal. Boston is very tribal. Emory had a sort of a Avis mentality. We can do better. Let's pitch in, do it together. And the city does too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so that kind of attracted me because it wasn't so self-satisfied, so to speak. And it was a little bit of the Wild West. They kind of let me do anything I wanted and gave good resources, were really supportive. It was a terrific experience.
So after that, you ended up as the CEO at the University of Chicago's health system, right? So what was that transition like? Because now you've gone from really kind of the academic role into the executive piece. You have different responsibilities. You have kind of a different purview over kind of how the university interacts with healthcare, how you think about patients and how you think about disease. So what was that like? Because that's kind of a big inflection point in terms of what you do and who you serve, really.
So I got a call from a guy named Don Randall, who was then president of University of Chicago. And Don was a musicologist by training and had been provost at Cornell, and before that on the faculty at Princeton. For a musicologist, I have to say he was the broadest scholar I think I've ever met. Things about everything. So I had no interest in looking, and used the excuse of travel. And he said, well, where are you going? And I said, I was going back to Boston for some reason. And he said, well, the chair of the board there will have his plane fly me to Chicago. We can meet, outside the airport for a couple of hours and then fly me back to Boston. What's wrong with that? So I did that. And I met Don, and he was just someone who I wanted to work for. Really charming, interesting, perceptive. And when I went on another trip then to the campus, it was clearly there was a job to do. Some of the intellectual heft had left the medical center. It needed rebuilding, both in hospitals and research buildings. And it's a really interesting university. And the medicine is almost uniquely, I think there's one other place that's structured like University of Chicago. So biology and medicine is all intermingled. So you're responsible for 100 undergraduate biology courses. The Department of ecology, evolution, you know, the dinosaur people, and the plant biologists, organismal biology. And so it was really interesting having this vast array of animals. We had Vivaria that not only had the usual mice and rabbits and transgenic mice, we had flying snakes and crocodiles. So it was an intellectually broad experience when you think of medicine, because it stretched it into other species. And there's a fellow there, Neil Shubin, who was a paleontologist, who wrote this book that was really well received, Your Inner Fish, and talks about how things from hiccups to other abnormalities that we have as humans were due to the bizarre dragging around of things like nerves during the evolution from fish.
Oh, wow.
He did an hysterically funny interview with Stephen Colbert when the Colbert Show was there. You can imagine.
I can imagine that'd be pretty good. So I'm intrigued by the fact that, you said there was obviously a job to do, and that's always interesting when starting something new. And this was, a role that you hadn't had before previously. Were there some of the things that you didn't know that you didn't know when you took it? It was one of these things where you kind of see the challenge in front of you, but what were some of the things that you kind of hadn't thought about, or just kind of came out of nowhere that, had you known them beforehand, might have changed your perspective?
So, how the money was going to work. So the CFO in the medical center, they call the biological sciences division because it's medicine and biology, had done an analysis of what the cash flow from grants back to the university. And the conclusion was that we were sending more money back to the university than probably we were getting in terms of the attributes that were coming back. Now, if you find yourself in that position, you can't say, well, I want that money, because that's historically fixed. Mm-hmm. And you'd be asking the president to take money away from the humanities. You can't do. But what you can do is say, I think we can expand our grant portfolio, and we cap what we currently have as this transaction, and have a new transaction for things that expand. We could roll over some debt. So I really just had faith that I could reasonably work with this president to get the resources freed up that we knew, and then we had to be successful. If we weren't successful, we weren't going to be able to do all these things. But we were able to, I think, rebuild the intellectual capacity there. We built 3 new research buildings, 4 if you count one we did for anthrax and the like behind the skewered walls of Argonne National Lab, and then new hospitals as well. So we really improved the infrastructure of the place, and spent a fair amount of time rethinking how we were going to do medical education as well.
Well, honestly, for most weeks, that would probably be able to take us up for an entire hour. But we still haven't got to the point where you got to the AMA yet. So how does the AMA factor into all of these things? You revamped and revolutionized the University of Chicago. How did the AMA factor in? When did they come, and how did you look at that challenge?
So after leaving Chicago, I spent 24 months. I wanted to do a walkabout. And what I mean by that is, I thought of medicine as academic medical centers, but, knew little about venture, private equity. My policy experience was limited. So I interacted through friends with various firms. And I'd had some network. I was on the advisory committee for Stanford Medical and University of Pittsburgh Medical and whatnot. Got to know a lot of people through those contacts. So a friend indicated that he thought that Mike Levitt, who was a former Secretary of Health and Human Services within the Bush administration, Bush 2, Mike and I would get along really well, and introduced us. And he had just left HHS and was putting together his own firm as a consulting firm in healthcare. And so I also spent time with Mike, although I indicated that I wasn't by nature a consultant, and I didn't like to waft in and then waft out, and everyone else gets the fun of doing it. So I did that, and then I got a call from the AMA, which I was a little surprised by, because I had sort of a vague knowledge of the AMA, although obviously I knew JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, and I knew the AMA was an iconic physician organization. What exactly it did was a little unclear to me. And I saw the mission statement, which is promote the art and science of medicine and the betterment of public health. And I thought, well, that's a great mission statement. I ended up liking very much the chair of the search committee. And then in thinking about it, I thought, well, this is, there are business components to the AMA, and it's kind of like the same, business like running a hospital, a health system would be. It has this House of Delegates, which I'm sure we'll talk about, which is like a giant faculty senate. And so those things, there are various components of it that seem new to me, that seem familiar to me, and the policy was familiar from work I did with Mike. So I thought, well, give this a try, because it's kind of interesting combination.
It really was like an amalgamation of every part sort of that you had touched before, right? It was different, but it had the same components of the work you had done sort of throughout your career.
Yeah, the same kind of experiences. It's still when you switch from academics to administration at a university, and from a university to consulting, and then from consulting to an association, it does give you the feeling of jumping out of the airplane and you're just hoping the parachute works. But it's really refreshing as well.
So for a little bit of background for everybody here, do you want to give us kind of the 3-minute pitch on, everything that the AMA does, if we can fit that into 3 minutes? Because I think most people's interactions with the AMA are, they read the quote from the AMA on articles when there's anything related to, policy or doctors or healthcare or anything like that. But it would probably be good to get a better understanding of everything the organization does.
Well, I'll give an equation of the pieces that equal the AMA, which I constructed my first year to explain it to my sister, because she was asking. But you can think of it as having like 5 different pieces. One is membership, and it's about 270,000 members. And everyone always thinks of it as a membership organization. But the second piece is, I think, maybe the most critical piece, and that's the House of Delegates. And the House of Delegates are delegations from all medical societies. So all 50 state societies, all 4 branches of military medicine, all the specialty societies, specialty societies you know about, like the American College of Cardiology, specialty science societies you haven't heard of, like Society of Underwater Medicine. And it's those 600 plus delegates that meet twice a year and make policy. Now, every physician in the United States, I'm sure there's an exception, but virtually every physician in the United States belongs to 1, 2, 3, 4 of those societies. So they are represented. So when you think of the House, you can think of it almost as an organization of organizations. And it's that org of org policy body that gives the prominence in DC. So you know that this is the best surrogate you have for the total voice of physicians. So that's the second piece. The third piece are business products. We steward and are responsible for the CPT coding system, the language of medicine that's updated each year, and used for claims and billing, but really used to understand, the workflows and operating principles of a larger system. We have another business aspect with guides to permanent impairment that's used for disability decisions, used in most states. And we have something called USAN, which assigns the generic names to drugs. So any drug that has a proposed, is new and is going to the FDA, has a proprietary name proposed, we have to interact and assign it a generic name that it will also use, eventually almost exclusively. So we have these various business products. And then we have research and development. And we have things like JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association. It's now the widest circulating medical journal in the world. 11 specialty journals that make the JAMA network. We have 3 arcs that we spend a lot of time on, which are the strategic framework of the AMA. Well, we can talk about that. And then the last piece, the 5th piece, is advocacy. Our offices, we have about 1,200 people in Chicago that populate all the microverticals of medicine. We have an innovation studio in Silicon Valley. And then we have about 100 people in our advocacy office. And there we're embedded in the committees of jurisdiction for healthcare in the Senate and the House, and the regulatory bodies, CMS, FDA, also have interactions with CDC and whatnot. And we use that to memorialize things that we can get accomplished. So we had done work on pre-diabetes programs, diabetes prevention programs. But, one of the problems was they weren't reimbursed through Medicare. And so 2 years ago, and working with the regulators, we got reimbursement through, so that was a way of memorializing that progress. So those are the pieces, and that's one way to look at the AMA. It's a sum of all of that, and then there's also a strategic framework I can touch on.
I feel like we need to get you back to the office. You've got, I don't know one person oversees all of that and make sure it all keeps on track and moving forward. So I'm even more impressed now than I was when you sat down with us a few minutes ago. I'm going to ask a totally random question. Why Chicago? And has the AMA always been in Chicago?
It's been in Chicago for more than 100 years. Chicago is a rich place in terms of the density of associations, central, good airport.
That might be debatable. The good airport.
It's a big airport with a lot of activity.
Big airport, yeah. We also have big airports, none of which are good. So
one thing that I did think was unique, and it may have been the sole thing that the AMA works on that you did mention, is I hadn't heard of FRIDA before, right? But you all also play a really strong role in helping match, right, with residency programs, which I thought was interesting that that's part of your remit.
That maybe I should touch on what the strategic framework is, because that
there you go.
Directly to it. In coming, we did a survey, an inventory, and found out that in the mission areas, we had projects that numbered 110, and they didn't really relate one to the other. And so no one knew what we did because we were doing too much at, the wrong scale. So we went through a process and boiled those 110 down to 3. And those were the strategic arcs of the organization that remain today. And one of those arcs is chronic disease, particularly now hypertension, because chronic, in the last 50 years, the disease burden in the United States has gone from episodic to chronic, and yet we're still bricks and mortar largely and set up for episodic disease. Yet chronic disease consumes more than 90% of that $4 trillion yearly healthcare spend. And, hypertension, over 100 million adults have hypertension. About half of those are not controlled, even though they're seeing a provider. So, a lot of work to do there. And that's what the focus in chronic disease is. Then another one is removing obstacles that interfere with patient-physicians interactions. And there are a lot of pieces of that, of course. And the third is education. And we started at the medical school level, built up a consortium of 37 medical schools. The curriculum is updated with new discoveries every year, but the structure of it and the assumptions underlying it hadn't been changed for a century. And the students were so good, they were able to overcome this crappy curriculum that we were giving them. So we revised the curriculum. We created a new platform in the curriculum for health system, something we call health system science. And that's expanded to lifelong learning. We now have a digital education hub, many content providers, including, Scripps and Stanford, Harvard, et cetera. And so we're doing a lot in lifelong education and the transition from medical school to residency and whatnot. And we have a lot of tools, Frida being one of them, introducing folks to these new environments.
I want to pick up a little bit on what you were talking about in terms of basically episodic versus chronic diseases. And I think it's one of the places where, healthcare is rapidly evolving to kind of step outside the brick and mortar, so to speak, and make its way to your kitchen. So can we talk a little bit about that and where you see things going over the next, say, 5 years, kind of near-term stuff? And, what do you think are kind of the first pieces of that are going to be the stepping stones to really making that happen?
So, what are the lesions to be addressed? The first lesion, and first and foremost, is the fragmentation of the healthcare system. So if you have chronic disease, continuity of care is really important. And yet we're the most highly fragmented system you can imagine.
Yeah. And when you say fragmented, that means going from different insurance company to insurance company, tenure or 2 years, that kind of thing?
Yeah. So, for example, not only jumping insurance companies, but if I have a brain lesion that's been treated at University of Chicago over the years, and I get into an accident at 2:00 in the morning by the lake, and I'm taken to Northwestern. Even though those two organizations utilize the same Epic platform for EHR, I will be a brand new patient there with no knowledge of what happened when they're looking at me in the emergency room. So it's terrible fragmentation, and there has been improvement. As people know they have portals to their EHR platform, but do you really get the information you're looking for from those portals? You get some, but not a lot. A lot of work to do there. The whole platforms were built on sort of the business billing systems that used to exist. And our EHR platforms are great for billings and claims and also risk mitigation. But for delivering the information in an organized way at the point of care that you need, they're not very good. They're also server-based, not cloud-based. So they're incredibly expensive to maintain. So that is one area. Another area is, in my own career, I saw the revenues move from 60 inpatient to 40 outpatient, to 40 inpatient to 60 outpatient. And now the next move is to the home. And that's just a few percent now. So, the thing to get over there, one of the areas of work we're doing in hypertension is it's known that if you get blood pressures by yourself and you verify that you're doing it the right way, and you're using a verified cuff, they're better blood pressures than you get in an institution. Most institutions don't do blood pressures correctly. So I'll just tell you what you need for a normal for a well done blood pressure. You need to have a validated cuff. You need to be relaxed for 5 to 10 minutes, sitting in a chair, not talking, feet flat on the floor, back supported, bladder empty, not talking, and the cuff has to be directly on the skin and with the elbow at 90 degrees. Now, typically what happens is it goes over your shirt, your feet are dangling off a table, someone's talking to you, you've had no time, you've just run down the hallway. So if you can get normal blood pressures at home, then, the next thing is to have a way of separating signal from noise while you're doing that. I think we have a tool that can do that. And then you want to transmit that to the cloud, download that into an EHR, and then have that self-organized in the EHR so one can see the chart of the blood pressures taken correctly at home. We don't have that now. We're working toward that currently, but that's a number one cause of death and disability in the United States. And we don't measure it correctly, and we don't have the system wired to follow it.
And like you said, we also don't measure it enough, right? If you're not measuring it in your house, and you measure it once a year when you go in to see your doctor, and that measurement isn't very good, you now have sporadic measurements that are also high noise, which doesn't help anybody.
That's correct. And then, so, there's a lot of room for digital improvements, in these fragmentation, moving to the home. But it has to be done in a way that, that has a healthcare system kind of effect to it rather than a one-off product. So those are going to be really important. AI is important. We think of it as not artificial intelligence, but augmented intelligence. And where that can be applied, the workflows are very complex because of the fragmentation of the billing and collections and with the way we handle insurance, and the workflows and the administrative work are attractive areas to apply AI. And you don't, one of the attractions is you're not going to kill anyone. One mistake in a billing or claims is compared with 1,000 mistakes without the AI tools. The other aspect would be decision support for physicians. That's going to be a lot of systems being built now in both of those areas. And then how to apply the different kind of AI, generative AI. There are the current problems with generative AI are you can create a beautiful document. Just an extremely beautiful document that's really well organized, but two of the major facts may be wrong.
Right.
The so-called hallucinations that occur in generative AI. And there's an argument there. So one side of that argument is it creates, it takes me 40 minutes to create this long organized document, but only 10 minutes to proofread and edit it, or 5 minutes. The countervailing view is you get sucked into sleeping and you don't do the editing that you should, and a major factual error remains. So these things all have to be worked out, but very powerful tools to bring to medicine.
Yeah.
So can we go back to the, I'm just thinking, for some reason, I'm kind of fixated on the whole piece at home, right? Like you were talking about, it's a very small piece, but in order for a patient to be able to know how to do it, and like you just explained it to us, right? And that it took a few minutes, but doctors need to be compensated, right, for training patients. Like, how do we work those pieces into the system so we have better health care, recognizing that the time spent by the physician is going to be a little different, right? It's not just going to be an interaction in the office.
Yeah.
Right now, we're an amalgam of carrots and sticks
Yeah.
that don't work, in terms of incentives. And it brings, another interesting topic to me is that Medicare, which seems to be the lead in modeling these things that the insurers then often take on. If you look at how they think about incentives, it's like no one's ever existed except Milton Friedman. I give you $20 and you do whatever I want.
Yeah.
Right.
And that was established before the power of behavioral economics, Kahneman, those folks, was recognized. And if you look at behavioral economics, what it demonstrates is that in complex cognitive tasks, if you get a mix of carrots and sticks and it makes no sense, it's actually a negative load on performance. So, what should be done? Well, we did a multi-market study with RAND some years ago to look at what are the intrinsic drivers of physicians. And the intrinsic driver, like 1, 2, and 3, was time with patients. And the thing that is the intrinsic driver for physicians is how much time I get to spend face-to-face with my patient. So then we did a time motion study, multi-market. How do physicians spend their time? For every hour they spend face-to-face with a patient, they spend 2 hours doing administrative tasks, often things that have shifted from assistance into the, that's one of the things that produces burnout in physicians as well. If you want to pull a string on a physician, you find a way to have them do less administrative work and spend more time with patients, which is like crazy that we don't do that, because of 2/3 of the time is administrative and we're facing a physician shortage. We're basically throwing away 2/3 of the workforce.
Yeah.
You also mentioned before, and I think this is a decent point, how our entire, the Epic systems are set up to help with billing, right? We're actually really good at paying for stuff the way that we always pay for stuff. And we're kind of really bad at figuring out any new way to pay for things, right? The path of least resistance is the CPT code already exists and there's already a way to bill for this. So this is the thing we're going to do next. And if you have to figure out a new way to do that, it's incredibly hard to do anything because no one's used to doing it a new way. And now you have to figure out, you have to go to someone to figure out how to get them to actually pay for it. And they're going to have all sorts of questions.
That's right. I think that's exactly right. So those things are, good targets for work. And then the targets that we work on the AMA, but we also have this innovation studio in Menlo Park in the West Coast.
Yeah, let's talk more about that.
And so we have this strategic framework of chronic disease, removing obstacles, lifelong education, and we have 3 accelerators that touch on all of them. One of those is advocacy for memorializing progress. One of those is equity, health equity, because inequities are our glass ceiling and trying to improve the health of the nation.
Yeah.
And then the third one is innovation. And there's a lot of innovation we can do internally at the AMA, but there was a need for a different type, more of a venture type innovation and a high technology innovation. And that requires a different kind of culture as well than the culture that we have, which is good for what we're doing in Chicago, but not ideal for venture creation.
Mm-hmm.
So I looked at some models of, many institutions have innovation shops. I noticed that there were possibly 3 issues with those institutional innovation shops, and some of those were also, is reflected in things like large companies as well. And the first is, no matter how hard the bureaucracy tries, it just can't keep its hands off the innovation center. So it loves it, but it pets the hamster until it dies. And the second thing is, institutions tend to define problems internally to the institution, and that often creates bespoke solutions that may not spread. And then the third thing is not everyone is in a New York, greater New York area or Silicon Valley area, Austin or something like that, where you have the people you want. So in looking around, saw a model that I thought really was appealing. And that's the model of In-Q-Tel, which is the CIA's answer to address these same problems that they created in the late 90s. So we copied some of that homework. And Health 2047 is for-profit, independently operating. The connection is I chair the board. And you can think of it as the commercial translation of the AMA strategic framework. And then there are a couple of principles that are a little different that we use there in the ideation. And one of those principles is problem definition. We define all problems around the physician-patient interaction. And a lot of what is done in healthcare would be the equivalent of General Motors thinking about the dealers, but not the drivers or the mechanics. It's done at the administrative level. What are the administrative problems? And then you get in the front lines of healthcare thrown over the transom, something that either doesn't work or is a one-off with 50 other one-offs. And then another principle is that we're going to have to partner with. These are big problems. We're going to have to do partnerships. We've spun out about 12 companies, 3 of which didn't survive, and I think all the companies except 2 were also invested in by United Health Group. And we now have a parallel fund as well. So the fund has investment theses that reflect the pillars of Health 2047 that are the commercial translation of the strategic framework of the AMA.
Well,
How hard was it to get to the point where you and your colleagues decided to do this, to stand up something as different and as innovative and outside of the AMA as Health 2047?
Well, it was we needed to expand our ability to innovate and do it in a way that is more akin to what highly innovative shops do with large problems. There's no question that venture in our society is the way to improve things and address big problems. If you look at the number of companies and that have spun out successfully, and you look at the venture aspect, there's a huge impact on both the IP and the number of companies that are successful that come from the venture area. Now, venture, as you know, has a lot of risk as well, so you need many of them. But the decision was really to try to use the proven framework of innovative approaches to big problems, and that's venture. Yeah.
No, I mean, it's and at this point the numbers around venture are reasonably well understood, so at least you have a handle on what the risk looks like. And there are ways to do things that are outside the normal way of operating, and you get different solutions to problems. You get to tap into entirely different engines of growth and everything else, because honestly nobody knows what the future is going to touch on. And
I was going to say, the interesting thing about this, one of the interesting things was a warning that I got from the person who put the program together or in QTEL. And that is the problem you're going to face is the interface there between CIA and QTEL, both much bigger organizations than we are. But that was exactly the problem that we had to face for the first 18 months. So the subject matter experts in Chicago viewed our West Coast gang as, out of control cowboys. And the West Coast gang viewed our Chicago folks as, stuffy, hard to deal with, niggling about, this and that little thing.
Shocked to hear all that. Shocked.
Yeah. And the way you get through that, the way we got through it, is we almost always have people from Health 2047 now in the AMA. We almost always have people from the AMA at Health 2047. And then we've done some collaborative projects that the AMA couldn't do by itself. And, it would probably have been misplaced at Health 2047. So, a couple of those, one is a product that allows the creation of a credentialing wallet for physicians. So currently the credentialing process takes several weeks, and the institution, say the hospital, is sitting on its thumbs paying a physician, and the physician's doing the same, sitting on his or her thumbs, waiting to be credentialed. Second example is a AI-driven product in which with the obviously the approval of the physician, the tool interrogates the EHR of the panel the physician has with particular attention at this point in time to what's coming down the road in the next week or two in terms of appointments. It then feeds into the literature, word searches based on what's in the actual panel, and organizes the best literature. And in our pilots, we show that with just a 10-minute utilization per week of physicians, they start improving the way they think about things, how they diagnose things, because you're creating educational product that they're convinced relates exactly to their panel. And that's another thing we've learned about physicians. If you make them check a box, if a pediatric psychiatrist who's never written a prescription for an opioid has to do opioid training as is currently done, it's displacing.
Yeah.
If you have physicians and you demonstrate that you're going to feed them information that's directly related to their patient panel, you can't stop them from eating it up. So we also have to make, the right information for the right physician at the right time available too.
So speaking of big problems, I just want to spend a couple of minutes on this because I don't think we can skip it.
Can't not do it.
Coming out of COVID, right? Like the AMA developed a recovery plan. Clearly, I think burnout, I mean, in a lot of places, but specifically, right, around physicians and treatment and the volume of new and different sort of patients they were seeing during COVID. How is that going to impact the long-term approach to sort of care providing in the physician community?
Well, a recent survey that we did, we're facing what's predicted to be somewhere between 30 and 120,000 physician shortage around 2030. Recent survey we did indicated that 1 out of 5 physicians are thinking of leaving their practice in the next 5 years and retiring. And the problem that we have with burnout is not a lack of resilience. Resilience has been measured, and it's actually very high compared with other white collar kind of professions. It's really the broken system. There's something broken in the system, and it's not the physicians. It's the fragmentation, the administrative load, and you can't yoga out of that. And so you really have to pay a lot of attention to fixing the system, giving hours back to physicians, having less administrative load. And there's so many things that burden physicians unnecessarily. We decided to take 5 of our highest priorities and put them in a framework for a recovery plan for American physicians. So since the COVID makes the wording recovery plan understandable to all as well. So, that included reforming Medicare payment. I'll just say a word about that because it's not, it's less money oriented than you think. If you look at, I'll say both physician and hospital separately, both have a system where they have, a zero balance, a kind of approach.
Yeah.
The difference is that zero balance on the hospital side is built on a system that increases the net to be spent with CPI each year. That CPI correction is not giving the physicians. The upshot of that is in the last 20 years, there's just been a 9% increase in reimbursement for physicians, which, if you take inflation into account, is a 26% decrease in compensation. So getting that related to CPI or the medical economic index or something that moves is important. And, to stop scope creep, to address burnout, to support telehealth, so that the flexibilities that we had during the pandemic have now been extended, but not beyond the end of 2024. We'd like to have those flexibilities for telehealth. I think everyone sort of recognized the power and importance of that if used correctly.
Yeah.
And then lastly, prior authorization.
That I imagine alone takes up a massive amount of effort and time for physicians.
Yeah, so on average, a physician will get something like 35 prior authorizations per week. And on average, it takes someone in that practice 16 hours per week to work through that. And we don't get a lot out of it. One thing that could be easily done is kind of a gold card, a physician that has prior authorizations turned over every time. It just takes work. Why don't they have a TSA kind of, sweep through the airport?
Yeah. TSA.
Clear.
Yeah.
You're clear to prescribe. And I know we only have 5 minutes left, but let's transition a little bit to talk about, and we've touched on this briefly, but we haven't called it sort of the value, right, around value in healthcare and what that means. And I know you, Derek, I think is going to put in the chat a National Academies link, but you do work around several different organizations that also focus on value.
Yeah. Value has almost become a non-meaningful term. Everyone uses it and people mean different things.
Yeah.
A lot of people actually mean cost reduction. And, what we really want is a system that works, that improves health and prevents disease, a kind of a wellness component to the healthcare system. The way it currently is tiny compared with the disease focus of the healthcare system. And it's more important now than ever before because of again, the chronic disease burden is our major burden, and it's mostly behavioral driven. And exercise, diet, these kinds of things. So I almost, try to avoid this term value because, people don't know what I mean by it. And
Or they think they know what you mean, but they
Yeah.
don't. And so they make assumptions.
yeah, so and then when it was started, it was, the quality you get for the dollar spent.
Yeah.
But then the decision was that every subspecialty, every area needed its own quality measures. Well, they just didn't exist in an evidence-based way. I mean, there are things like hemoglobin A1C, blood pressure, things that are unequivocally important and linked to quality and decrease in disease burden. But people that study the inner ear, get their quality measures too. And sometimes the physicians that are in these specialties don't even believe that the quality measures do anything because the literature is not there. But it had this approach of everyone has to have something, even if the evidence base is weak.
Mm-hmm.
And it sort of deteriorated the entire concept.
One of the reasons sort of there's been so much flux around quality or value and outcomes is that one reason why we've seen sort of I'll call it a uptick, a surge, whatever you want to call it, in these groups of what I would call physicians coming together to have preventative practices. And we see them in large cities, right? Like we see them in New York, and where it's largely driven by convenience and prevention and sort of almost one-stop shop, right, for a patient.
Yeah, yeah. I think what we'll see in the future is more, team-based care that has extenders. We learned through a company that came out of the shop in Menlo Park, First Malcare, that was a diabetes prevention company. That the sort of all the things that behavioral economists would predict are true. That if the recommendation to go into a diabetes prevention program comes from the physician's office, the uptake of that is an order of magnitude better than if it comes from, say, the payer. If there's a cohort that's held together, they stick together well. If there's a means of getting the information back in an effective way, so you have tools that can go into the EHR of that physician's practice and, pull out things like hemoglobin A1C, but also put in things like what, the weight loss and whatnot that has occurred and the effects on hemoglobin A1C, then it works. And then it's not fragmented. And, what doesn't work is, if you think you're going to do that, the feedback loop is going to be fax machines. And someone has a big pile of paper instead of, an organized chart, to look at. So these kinds of extensions of the physician's office, we know physicians don't do, behavioral corrections very well. There's very little time. And even if there were time, it's not something that's been embedded in the training very much. They can say you should lose weight. Well, that doesn't work. I tell myself I'm going to lose weight. I don't do it. And some of these things about risk, and quality, you are also easily summed without a lot of complications. As I mentioned, blood pressure. Blood pressure that's correctly taken, is really important. If you really want to, if you're a man and you want to know your risk for death and disability, well, take off the belt and look at the number in the back, and you have a pretty good surrogate. So, there are a lot of simple things that we can collect, and we do, and we just don't react to them appropriately or effectively.
Well, listen, we're after 10 now, and honestly, we could keep going for another hour. This has been fantastic. I mean, we've touched on everything, and ultimately, I think really here is you've hit on a number of things that systemically probably need to change and are likely to change over the next 10 years. So, we like to be forward thinking with where kind of biotech and health is going, and it's wonderful to talk to somebody that's kind of at the center of all of it, and is really aligned with where things should go for better patient outcomes. So Jim, it was wonderful to have you with us today. Thank you so much. And to everybody else, thanks. I hope you have a great day.
Thank you
Thanks,
as
Jim.
well.
See you, everyone. Thank you, Jim.
Bye.